This program, while curated to help you improve your health, contains general advice and should not replace the individual advice of your medical practitioner.
So to me, the emotional connection is literally when we swallow our feelings.
And we survived as best we could in a threatening environment, whatever it was.
If you're just treating the gut with food and supplements and, what you're eating, then you're only treating it 1/3 of the way.
What I don't like is this unrealistic expectation of what health is.
And it is everything that is, problematic.
You're an infant and you start screaming and crying. Your mother runs into the room to see what's wrong.
Isn't it interesting, like one of the oldest sayings, I've just got a gut feeling about that.
Yeah. Yes. Our gut is so smart.
In life, it's normal to have ups and downs. But what do we do when we get stuck? I've always been fascinated by the health journey. Why do some people get better while others fail to make the shift? In Season 1 of The Shift, we explore the fascinating field of gut health and help you discover what is really going on with your digestion, microbiome, and health.
The gut is amazing.
Changes our concept of the human body. Become useless to the healthcare system.
We're always shifting. Your genes are shifting, your microbes are shifting, everything is shifting.
I'm Catherine Maslin, and this is The Shift. In the last episode of The Shift, we examined the deep systemic dysfunction in our health and food industries that have allowed us to be fed the wrong information about what we need to do. For some of you, the concepts of gluten or dairy or sugar damaging your gut may be new. However, what I have observed by working with thousands of people is that a lot of the time, we know something is bad for us, but we eat it anyway. Take smoking, for example. For decades, we've known it's bad, but when this information first came out, most people continued to smoke. It wasn't until recent years, when smoking had become more socially unacceptable, that its uptake has begun to decline. The majority of people know that consuming confectionery, sweets and fast food is bad for our health. So why do we do it anyway? Why is it that even when we find out, without a doubt, that a food is bad for us, we find it so difficult to give it up? In this episode of The Shift, we explore the psychology of food, the emotional and subconscious reasons behind why we eat what we eat, and how we can harness this to make better decisions for our health and our lives. This is a biggie, guys, so get ready. When we eat poorly, is it about the food or something else? I wanted to know what nutritionist Angela Pfeiffer thought.
Everybody has some sort of connection with food, some good, some not good, right? And then, just the varying degrees. So I think as we look at that, it's helping people kind of see through. For the most part, like with any bad habit, it's not about the food. It's not about the habit. It's not about smoking. It's not about whatever other vice they're using, alcohol, that glass of wine every single night, sort of thing. So it's really not about the food at that point. So it's figuring other ways to help them connect with their environment and help fill up their cups so they can meet the needs of everything else they have going on.
So tell me, if it's not about food, what is it about?
It's going to be something different for each person.
We each have a different relationship with food, but how does this relationship form? Food is something that is so ingrained in our behaviours, and it can invoke some very strong emotional reactions from people. Functional medicine specialist Dr. Tom O'Brien has worked with thousands of patients. I wanted to know how he thought we forged our relationships with food.
It's very, very threatening. Why? Because those neural networks that were formed as a child, and we survived as best we could in a threatening environment, whatever it was, whether it was an abusive household, whether it was trauma. When you're a child, you try to survive any way you can. And those neural networks that develop, when you're exposed to a similar type of stress as an adult, those are the neural networks that are activated. So those survival mechanisms come into play. Now you've got more tempering of your immediate response as an adult, but those are the neural networks. And instead of screaming as an adult, you may just get all keyed up and your heart rate kicks up and your breathing becomes shallow and fast. It just depends on what your response mechanism is. But those neural networks were developed to save your life. They are part of what's called the sympathetic nervous system, a sympathetic response, the fight, flight, or fright. And until people deal with recognizing what those wiring patterns of the brain are that developed in childhood, I'll give you an example. You're an infant and you start screaming and crying. Your mother runs into the room to see what's wrong. There's nothing wrong. What does she do? She gives you the breast, or she gives you a bottle, or she gives you a cookie so that you stop crying and you feel better. Well, it may have been a bird that flew by the window and it just scared the heck out of you. But you begin associating fear with oral gratification. And so anytime anything fearful, anything that kind of catches you and makes you apprehensive comes up, there is a neural network that says oral gratification. And you eat something or you drink something. And for people who are trying really hard to lose weight and they're being careful, not eating excess calories and not eating junk food, they're having a hard time, there's a neural network set up that often has to be addressed.
This is why we get the yo-yo effect, and one of the reasons why people have such a hard time sticking it out when it comes to health changes. Emotional eating is something a lot of you will be familiar with. We're tired, we go for a pick-me-up. We're sad, we go for the chocolate. We feel bad about ourselves, we eat junk food. And while these things might make us feel better in the short term, ultimately we know they will make us feel worse. Christine Hassler is one of the world leaders in the emotional wellness space and the author of the best-selling book Expectation Hangover. With a background in psychology, she knows a thing or two about emotional health. We had a chat about emotions, why we suppress them, and the implications of this for our health.
So to me, the emotional connection is literally when we swallow our feelings. So a lot of people will say feelings are a response to a thought. I don't know that that's entirely true. Maybe feelings are. Like anxiety is definitely a response to a thought of something we can't control or something in the future. Guilt's definitely a response to a thought of self-judgment. But a lot of things like shame, sadness, anger, I feel like those are emotions. That's energy in motion. There's some things that I think happen in life where the physiological response is fear or shame or anger. I don't know that that's always created by a thought. I think that we get scared. It triggers the fight or flight system in our brain, and we feel these really powerful emotions. And as kids, as adults, we don't always feel safe to express them because we have to keep something a secret, or because we have to be good, or because we try to express them but we're shamed for them, or because someone else is uncomfortable with our emotions so they oversoothe us. It's one thing I tell parents, like, don't oversoothe your children. Like when they get upset, like let them ride out a temper tantrum. Make a little space for them and let them ride the wave of the emotion. Because if emotion is suppressed, energy in motion, right? Where does that energy go? It's just like we hold it into our body. And so much of that happens in our gut because literally we're swallowing our feelings. And, our digestion is our main processor. It's where everything goes through. And so if emotion, energy in motion isn't coming up and out, where is that energy going? It's going to all different places in our body. And I think most physical things have an emotional component. It's not just something I think, it's been proved by science and research over and over and over again. But so much of it goes to the gut because it's just so big, there's and it's responsible for so much. And I think because if we think energetically, we think in terms of chakras, it's also our third chakra, which is our power center. And when we don't express our emotions, when we aren't speaking our truth, when we feel suppressed or repressed in any way, we do feel disempowered. And so I think it eats us up inside.
Isn't it interesting? Like one of the oldest sayings, I've just got a gut feeling about that.
Yeah. Yes. Our gut is so smart. It's so smart. And that's the other thing I think that is a way that we, cause tension in our gut is when we go against our intuition.
If you're just treating the gut with food and supplements and what you're eating, then you're only treating it 1/3 of the way. You will get better faster if you're also treating the emotional side of it and the spiritual, energetic side of it.
That was Kate Reardon. Kate is a naturopath, nutritionist, author, and intuitive healer. Kate is a trailblazer when it comes to emotional and spiritual health. I wanted to know why she thought people had such an emotional attachment to food.
I think that it's because something is missing and we're trying to fill a hole because we are not in our wholeness. So food, or you can insert anything here, food, booze, sex, drugs, anything really. There's a hole there that we are wanting to be filled. And food's an easy one, and it's also a quite acceptable one. I'll just eat a packet of chocolate biscuits, or I'll go to the shops and eat 4 pizzas or whatever it is. And people are like, yeah, I totally get that. It's kind of like a socially acceptable void filler, if that makes sense. But I really feel what I know to be true in my life and in what I've seen in my patients is that we're looking to get out of the current state that we're in, and we're using food as a vehicle to get there. So for example, we all know the analogy of my boyfriend just broke up for me, I'm going to reach for the ice cream. When you look at the actual ice cream and when you break it down and really dissect that story, it's like, I want to feel sweeter again. I want that rush of chemicals in my bloodstream to give me a little high so that I can actually attach to some love instead of just being in this dark, deep, depressive state of I'm not good enough, I'm broken, whatever story is playing. It also takes you out of your pain body. So whenever we're depressed, upset, anxiety, grief, shame, guilt, whatever it is, that's a pain. It's a suffering that we're feeling, experiencing in our bodies. If we get a quick sugar hit, that takes us out. It might be for 2 seconds, but it's still that escape. But what we're really wanting and really looking for is usually that feeling of wholeness. And that's the thing about food, is when you've eaten all that stuff, you feel full. Quite obviously, that's a disgusting full. Like, why did I eat all that? But there is that sense of fullness. And so when I look at emotional eating, a lot of it is what can I control when I'm feeling completely out of control? And can I take myself out of my pain body when all I can feel is pain?
So a lot of people are going around suppressing emotions rather than expressing them or working through them or letting them go. Can you tell me, why does this seem to be the default position for humans? And also, what are the physical consequences of that for their body?
I just think that conditionally, generationally, like there's so many barriers for us to truly and safely, more importantly, express our emotions. And the majority of it is because we weren't ever allowed as kids, It's just like a crying baby. Quick, shut it up. Put a pacifier in, put a dummy in, give it something. Like we don't show any emotion. And also, I think that, there's some shame there. There's real shame about being emotional sometimes, or too much or too little, or you can't think that, and comparing your wounds to someone else's wounds, and I shouldn't be like that. Like, it's just this kind of thing that boils down to we weren't really given ourselves permission to express, and then we don't have the tools to express them in a healthy way. So we'll bottle them up and then we'll explode, and people will get angry and have bar fights or road rage, or there's a point of emotions where if it's in our body and it's not being fully expressed in a healthy way, then there is a tipping point, and it will always come. And it usually comes on those people that we love the most, because we know that they're going to forgive us. So it's the guy that's had a really bad day at work, and then he comes home and his wife's like, oh, dinner's going to be 10 minutes late, and then he just goes off the handle. It's not her at all, but it's just his tolerance and capacity because he hasn't had any safe spaces. And then there's the opposite of that, where people are expressing it almost not too much, but in an unhealthy way. So they're telling all their problems to everyone in their life, and just it's kind of bleeding out all over the place. So I think it has so many different tentacles and how it works in people's lives. But this is what I know to be true. You need to understand how you operate so that you can really healthily have a place where your emotions are being expressed.
For a lot of you, I recognise this information will be new. You might not think that examining your emotions has a place on an audio documentary about gut health. But please listen with an open mind, because I know from experience that for a lot of you, this will be the missing link. Here's Christine Hassler again, talking about why we turn to food when we get emotional.
So all of us are sensitive. You know, we're born with these big open hearts, and we know that we're just pure love. And then things happen and we forget. And we start really suppressing who we are. And for so many of us, we didn't get a lot of soothing as a kid, or we didn't get a lot of nurturing, or we didn't get a lot of pleasure. And so the easiest replacement for that is food. So when we feel a big emotion, we're both taught that food will soothe it. And whenever we're feeling a big emotion, we are looking for soothing, right? And we're looking for a shift in it. So we're looking for pleasure. I really learned this when I started doing somatic emotional release work. And I learned that when the body's feeling a big emotion, it needs to come out. It needs to be expressed and soothed and allowed. And then the body needs pleasure. It needs to be hugged, or it needs to stroke on the arm, or you need a little stuffed animal you can cuddle up with, or someone to stroke your hair. Same thing. If you imagine a little kid after a temper tantrum, they go all the way through it, and then they need a hug. They need a little nurturing. So when we're not doing that, and we're just suppressing our emotion, food kind of does the job. It soothes us because it distracts us, and it gives us a moment of relief, and it gives us some kind of pleasure.
If somebody has an emotion that's trying to come up, what is the result of them then having the sugar or the alcohol or these suppressants? What will happen?
Oh, a variety of things will happen. One, the emotion will get farther suppressed. And two, well, obviously we know it's not good for your gut to have sugar and alcohol and processed foods and all that kind of stuff. So it's going to throw off your digestion, which is going to throw off your brain chemistry, which is going to affect your serotonin. I mean, it's amazing to me that when people have a hard day, they have alcohol, because alcohol is a depressant. So it just messes up your serotonin levels, and it's going to make you feel more depressed and more foggy the next day. So drinking alcohol to feel good is just the wrong direction to go, because it's just going to make you feel worse. And this is the most dangerous thing. If I'm using food, alcohol, sugar to treat my emotions, I have to keep upping the ante. It's not like one glass of wine is going to work for a year. If I'm drinking one glass of wine to suppress, I'm going to need 2 glasses of wine the next week, and then 3, and then a bottle. And then all of a sudden, I'm an addict. So this is the danger of not dealing with our feelings, is the coping devices and the numbing devices that we need to suppress become larger and larger and larger. And before we know it, either our health is really down in the dumps, or we have an addiction.
From working with thousands of patients, I know that learning doesn't always equate to doing. For some of you, I know that you'll listen and take action right away. But for others, you're going to need a little more help. That's why I've developed my Gut Shift program. Over 12 weeks, I'll take you through what you need to make a shift in your gut health step by step. It's based on the latest clinical research combined with the clinical experience from seeing thousands of patients. Registrations are now open. Go to theshiftclinic.com and click on Shift with Us.
The Shift!
Emotions around food can run deep. One of the things I was most surprised about when I went into clinical practice was the large amount of patients that I saw with a history of an eating disorder. I found this especially prevalent in patients with chronic digestive issues, which makes sense given that during an eating disorder there is disordered eating, which in turn can affect the digestive tract. I also noticed that some people's behaviours around food were unhealthy. Things like restrictive eating or overeating or binge eating were very prevalent. Diane Ryan is a psychologist from Arizona. She's been working with patients overcoming addictions and eating disorders for decades. I asked her if she'd noticed an increase in people with eating disorders over the years.
Without a doubt, there's always been a number of adolescents. Around the time of puberty was that, we see the incidence rise. But we also see an increased amount of two things. In adults, as they reach their mid-20s, they begin to notice that their lives have been really impeded by various kind of traumatic memories, and they don't really necessarily know where they come from or what's happening, but things start to get wonky, and they have disturbances in their life, and especially in their relationships, their ability to really express themselves in the way they would like to in their lives. So we see a high incidence of that. And then there's been a really what I consider to be a spike in people that are over 40 really recognizing eating disorders, and I think that certainly is another thing that feeds into the physiological piece as well.
What is an eating disorder, and what are sort of the main types that people experience?
There's not just one condition. It's actually a cluster of symptoms that produce really a disruption in the relationship with food and an inability to be able to carry out normal life activities because of this disruption. I mean, it becomes pretty profound. There are different kinds of eating disorders. One that with which people are familiar frequently is anorexia, because you can really notice that when somebody is pretty strikingly underweight. Oftentimes they'll be exhibiting symptoms of that because that has to do with weight restriction. But there are a number of other eating disorders. Bulimia is one, where people eat and then somehow are able to compensate for that calorie intake in terms of purging, laxative use, and sometimes exercise. So probably the most common eating disorder is binge eating disorder. And the issues for these different kinds of conditions are similar, but they're different. And then there's also some subsets of that. Orthorexia, we see quite a few people with what we consider to be orthorexia. And this is certainly plays into the naturopathic world a lot, because people that oftentimes will go to a naturopath to try to get to tweak their diet and because they have food sensitivities. And a lot of times when that's taken to an extreme, it develops into a condition where healthy eating becomes the god. It's like your spirituality. So you're a good person because you eat in a particular way. And taken to its extreme, this is extraordinarily destructive. There's a condition called ARFID, avoidant and restrictive food eating disorder. We see that in children a lot when they just are, it's not so much for a body image purposes, but it is for purposes of restricting food or controlling sometimes gag reflexes. And I think there can be, physiological substrates to that as well. And then there's exercise addiction, which you probably see quite a bit of, which is really difficult to tease out because exercise is normally healthy behavior, and we encourage people to do that. But again, it's a lot of this taken to extreme, and what happens to people when these kind of symptoms interfere with their ability to function in their lives.
Can you see similarities between the people you used to work with sort of more classically known addictions to food type addictions?
For me, it shows up more and more as an addiction in terms of the effect that it has on people's lives and the ways that we need to treat it. So that's certainly my perspective, especially certain components of it. The exercise part is certainly an addiction in terms of the increase in frequency, the withdrawal symptoms. And of course, people do experience emotional withdrawal when they try to recover. So there are a lot of similar components to addictions and eating disorders.
What about when we overeat? There's no secret that waistlines are on the increase, with the biggest cause of this due to food. In 2016, 38% of people worldwide were overweight and 13% were considered obese. Binge eating is incredibly common and something that we've all done at one time or another. But when does it become something more serious?
Not everyone that has what some might consider to be a weight challenge has binge eating disorder. It really is an emotional definition of the fact that people use food in a particular way to solve emotional and life problems in a way it was never meant to be. And the attendant results that happen to your body really increase responses. It has classically been associated with trauma and people's responses to sexual trauma, but it isn't necessarily that, although that certainly does occur.
So can you tell me why it happens then, and what does it actually look like? Because I guess a lot of people might be listening and thinking, well, I sort of binge eat from time to time. When does it turn into something that can be quite problematic or a bit more of a disorder?
I think really the way that a person can identify if they're suffering from binge eating disorder is just the sense of being out of control. They really feel that they do not have agency over whether they can choose to eat or not. It's like under certain emotional conditions, under certain times of the day, sometimes it's in the middle of the night, they will begin to eat, and they will eat way past the point of fullness, past the point of discomfort. And it has this very, very out of control aspect that's really painful. I mean, it's physically painful and it's emotionally terribly painful because they have an understanding that this is in control of their lives. And they really want to have agency and they don't want to have the effects of this, but it really has sort of taken control.
So how would you compare binge eating disorder with things like smoking cigarettes or drinking alcohol or taking other kinds of drugs to help to deal with emotions?
Mm-hmm. That's a really interesting and kind of a controversial question, whether or not an eating disorder is a straight up addiction, whether it fits. And I think in many times it does, because if the criteria for it is, does it get worse? I mean, is the behavior increase? And it generally does. I mean, one of the reasons that people seek treatment is that, they may start out binging occasionally, which is, as you say, very common, but then it sort of takes over and becomes really extreme. So in that sense, it is very much like that. The difficulty with food in general and addiction is that you can't, with alcohol, drugs, you can just become abstinent. You can stop the behavior. You can never stop eating. That's a whole different challenge and much more challenging in many ways.
You met Rebecca Coombs in episode 1. She's the author of 4 fantastic SIBO cookbooks, which were born out of her own struggles with the condition. Here, Rebecca shares how disordered eating shows up for her.
I can get very obsessive with food, and I am that classic type A person. I am all or nothing. I'm either 100% or I'm 0%. I find moderation really difficult. At the moment, I am 100% into being really clean with my food and not drinking alcohol. And that is a form of disordered eating because I don't allow slips. And so I've recognised that is something that I need to be very mindful of. Obviously, at the moment, it's considered healthy, but I have to be very conscious of how I approach food.
I think a lot of you could resonate with this, that we need to be really mindful about our psychology and thought process around how we eat. Rebecca also has a history of an eating disorder, which you'll learn more about when we release the Expert series. I asked Rebecca what came first, her gut symptoms or her disordered eating.
I think it's an interesting link, and it's a real chicken and the egg. I've had gut issues my whole life. I remember as a very young little girl saying, "Mummy, my tummy feels funny." And I've had food sensitivities since day one. I question, did SIBO come first or did the disordered eating come first to lead to the SIBO? I suspect SIBO came first. There's a really interesting piece of research being done by Diane Ryan, who works with people with eating disorders, and she's studying whether SIBO precludes eating disorders or whether eating disorders create SIBO.
I was very interested to hear more about this research that Diane Ryan had conducted about eating disorders and SIBO.
Well, I think, and this is kind of what got me interested in SIBO in the first place. I mean, I hadn't ever really heard of SIBO. I knew that a number of my clients have IBS and all kinds of other gastrointestinal challenges. And I always wondered, a lot of times, well, kind of the overall perspective is that if you just begin to eat appropriately, if you repair your relationship with food and start to eat a variety of foods in the right way, many of those things resolve. And indeed, that is often the case. But certainly many people come to us with all kinds of, of classic GI symptoms. Gastroparesis is one of the classic ones. So that's something that you can have that and then respond by not eating to that. And you can also develop that over later in your life from the fact that you're not eating. So it's kind of a chicken and the egg kind of thing. It's like, who knows which came first? So I think this is true with SIBO. It's like I started to wonder if people had SIBO and were maybe, because they were having those symptoms, the gas and the bloating and the diarrhea and all that stuff, maybe they were restricting their eating in response to some of those symptoms. And then certainly there's a possibility that they develop SIBO as a result of their eating disorder. And of course, what happens in the gut in terms of people's response to trauma sets you up for these kind of the symptoms that cause you to not feel like eating. So it certainly feeds the symptoms and the restriction.
And what about binging and purging? What effect does that have on the gut, do you think?
Well, it's interesting because, when I started to talk to people about SIBO, if you think about the act of purging, it's a pretty violent act. and things are going in the wrong direction. And the fact that it has a gastric emptying, I mean, in terms of acid balance in the stomach, you're actually going to destroy the acid balance in your stomach and reduce that to a point where sometimes it takes a long time to repair that when you begin eating appropriately again.
You might think that perhaps a history of an eating disorder is quite an extreme cause of gastrointestinal symptoms, but they're so common that I thought it was worth having a conversation about. In the case of SIBO, motility issues are a prominent part of the condition, causing bacteria from the large intestine to migrate up into the small intestine. Long-term restriction of eating or frequent vomiting can disrupt the normal peristalsis or movement through the intestines and contribute to dysbiosis and SIBO. An eating disorder is at the extreme end of the scale, but there's no doubt that a lot of us have disordered eating at times, or that we have a lot of emotional distress around food. Like Diane mentioned, if we have a problem with alcohol, we can avoid it. But if we have a problem with eating, it's a lot more difficult to avoid the temptation when we think about it at every meal. Add this to the fact that a lot of the foods that we eat when we're emotional also set off the pleasure centres in our brain, so it can be very difficult to keep our diet free from the foods that are harming our gut. Working through your emotions can be a rocky journey, and you had some great suggestions from both Kate and Christine earlier. But what do we need to do? One of the big things that I've discovered over the years is that we need to be very conscious of the effect of our environment and the things that we're exposed to. One of the more recent things that we've had to deal with as humans is social media. Jenny Tichy and I had a conversation about this. One of the things that's really bugging me at the moment is Instagram wellness promoters, what do we call them? Wellness gurus, if we say. And this is people who are promoting wellness. They've got massive followings. They have no formal training, so no actual degrees in health or wellness. They might be a health coach or something like that. But they're the ones that people are sort of listening to and paying attention to. So they're putting out programs, they're putting out messaging. But what I don't have anything against health coaches per se. I think anyone that wants to spread the word on health, it's a positive thing. But what I don't like is this unrealistic expectation of what health is. So you have people who are doing yoga in bikinis, who are, posting perfect pictures of them all the time about their perfect life, and then that is seen as health. Yeah. What do you think about that?
Well, it's interesting. So I have a teenager now, a female, so a daughter who's 14, and I can see how differently that generation is using social media. And I'm not going to say to their advantage. I think there are advantages of using social media, for sure. I think there are. But I think you're right. The messages that they're receiving in terms of the ideal body shape, in terms of the ideal life, they're very unrealistic. And certainly, when people are getting paid by brands, and I know, it can happen. I can get given food, for example, and asked to promote it, but I will not work with any brand that I do not 100% agree with, the ethics of, the quality of the product, and whether it actually does work. But I do think a lot of these people, because they become so influential, are influencing our next generation, particularly through the likes of Instagram, which are very visual imagery, in a potentially threatening way, because if they follow, it's a classic phrase, isn't it? But they don't listen to mum or dad, they listen to their peers. And if they're listening to their peers who are uneducated or uninformed, or potentially even touting sort of dangerous information, then they could be going down the wrong path.
On social media, you're seeing a tiny portion of people's lives. For women in particular, we grew up looking at magazines and billboards with messages about what society portrayed as normal and perfect. What you see on social media is the modern version of this. Let's look at yoga, for example. What yoga is really about is going within. It's an amazing practice for getting in touch with your body. But what yoga is becoming is more about aesthetics, wearing the right clothes or doing a perfect pose, for example. In fact, a picture of someone on the beach doing a backwards bend looking perfect on Instagram is the opposite of what yoga is about. Looking at images like this can make us strive towards this place of perfection, which is completely unrealistic. As Charlotte Watts is a yoga instructor, I asked her what she thought about these Instagram yogis.
Well, me and a friend were actually going to set up this Instagram account. We were going to do it anonymously. I mean, if we had time to do this, but it would be hilarious. Called Yoga porn, or just showing off. And then we would just like rate pictures anonymously. Yoga, porn, or just showing off. And believe me, because even pictures of meditation, there is a picture of a woman meditating, which is so used. You may recognize it. She's in, I don't think she's wearing a bra. She's tan, she's lithe, she's beautiful. She's got a kind of wet, light linen top on. She's kind of in front of a waterfall in a tropical environment. She has a chin pushed up. She has the most awful meditation posture. It really upsets me because she's really compressed at the base of her skull. But she's, it's used so much for meditation. And it is everything that is, problematic. Because even in that image of meditating, which is, a totally internal process.
So how do we move past these external influences that make us feel so bad about ourselves? And how can we cultivate a sense of self-love and self-appreciation? How can we be happy with our own bodies and where we're at right now? I spoke with Diane Ryan about this.
As parents, as adults, as role models, we really have to become more accepting of our own bodies. I mean, for a parent to go, oh, this makes me look, I think I look fat in this. You have to be scrupulous about how you language that stuff. And you have to really model self-love if you're going to expect your kids to do that. Otherwise, how are they going to be content with themselves? And they're going to think, well, if she has a problem, then what about me? So I think that's something that really, there needs to be a really strong consciousness with parents and other adults about, and accepting people the way they are, and not, you don't need that second helping of that. Or, you have to be careful because you just don't know what message you're giving. It's like, oh, you're telling me I'm fat. So, I better not do that. And, it's obviously not every kid is going to be susceptible to those kind of messages. But if you've got somebody that is susceptible, it can really do damage. So we really have to have that consciousness ourselves and how we feel about ourselves. Do we love ourselves? Do we love our bodies? Do we accept ourselves?
I want to share something with you, and that is that I've never known a person that fully and unconditionally loved themselves that didn't look after their bodies. When we love ourselves, we want to do good things for ourselves. But we're so programmed to do just the opposite of that it can take some time and support to be able to work towards this goal of complete self-acceptance. Let's check back in with Jodie, who you met in episode 6, because her story really demonstrates the power of this. You may remember that Jodie struggled a lot with issues like anxiety, depression, and gut symptoms. I wanted to know how it affected her day to day.
Honestly felt inadequate a lot of the time in how I looked and how I felt, because people around me felt great, could eat whatever they wanted, looked great, and that wasn't me. So I was like, why isn't that me? I want to be there. I want to eat whatever I want and feel great and not have, any issues. But now I feel just really happy with where I am because I've learnt so much throughout this process. So I think the biggest shift is just how I view myself and, how I speak to myself. That's probably been the biggest thing.
The healing journey can be challenging at times, so I asked Jodie, what was the hardest part about going through this process?
The time that it actually took to really get better, and I mean like in all aspects, mentally and physically. Because I thought in my head that it was going to be a really quick process and that, maybe 6 months I'd be feeling great, my mental space would be wonderful, my skin would be great, I'd be looking great, feeling great. And the reality is that so many things changed, and physically I was feeling a lot better. But in terms of the mental stuff and, the social stuff and the other aspects of my life that I really had to turn around, it took longer than I anticipated.
Reviews help us know that we're hitting the mark with what you need and help us to shape future seasons. I'd really appreciate it if you could take a few moments to leave us a review. I would love to know what you think.
The Shift!
Not everyone's going to do an about face the next day, and I think that can be really overwhelming. I would think about it in terms of if you push off eating earlier in the day because you're kind of scared of it, you're often overeating in the evening. If you push off eating in the earlier part of the day, you're almost setting yourself up to eat more into the evening. So I always have everybody pick a lean, healthy breakfast, and you're going to start with that, and that is just your first goal. Don't change anything else. And when you have that meal, you have to sit down. It can't be on the run. It can't be in the car. And I want you to actually look at the food, smell it, think about what it's going to taste like, take your first bite and put your fork down or spoon down or whatever, and taste the food. So to me, that usually starts to set the tone for that meal. And I have them do that for a week, and then we start working on lunch. And we just start slowly moving that way. And what I'll find is if we're having something for breakfast that's a bit more substantial, the binging in the evening starts to subside. So that starts to build the confidence as well. And so it's really, to me, about replacing oftentimes and having them focus on a few easy tasks and then working on some mindfulness around that. And I have them do that with their first bite at each meal, which really, to me, again, sets the stage, slows everything down a little bit, and then there's a better connection going on there. Definitely cleaning out the pantry. If you feel addicted to food, you can't have the cookies in the house. And they can't be in the house because you have kids. You need to set a better example and do what's right for you so they see that.
Some great tips from nutritionist Angela Pfeiffer there. Look at taking small steps to begin with. Not many people can change everything overnight. It isn't sustainable and it's too much to handle at once. I mentioned the fact that we need to be aware of how we're existing if we want to change this. When we're looking at addressing your emotional well-being, we talk about being embodied. This means that you are in your body and aware of what is happening for you. In my experience, being aware of what is wrong with you is more important than being symptom-free. I asked nutritionist and yoga instructor Charlotte Watts what it means to be embodied.
So embodiment is that feeling that you occupy your body, that you are here and you are present. So within any kind of mindful practice, in order to become embodied, we would look to ground. And grounding is the process we do to allow ourselves to feel embodied. And grounding is anything that we do to give ourselves a real, and I do mean that real, just want to kind of underline that, palpable, literal, not in the way teenagers use it, but literal sense of where we are, the size and shape we are in the present moment. So that is, if you imagine your body, if you feel your hands and feet, that you can feel them, the size and shape they are, where they are in relation to your arms, your head, your feet, everything else. So to be embodied is to have that awareness. Now, we can never be completely embodied in the sense that you can't feel everything that's going on. And it's quite usual to feel absent in some parts of us, disconnected. You know, we make sense of the world by differentiating stuff, by breaking things apart. But the idea is in when we do things that are helping us to become more embodied, that we're integrating back again. So we have more and more chance of feeling ourselves as whole. But feeling whole isn't necessarily simply being able to feel everything absolutely all the time. It's really just having an acceptance that we're whole and accepting that, you know, maybe today I'm just not feeling my feet that well, or my sense of grounding's a bit off, or, you know, it's why we do things like balance in yoga. It gives us information about, oh, look at me, I'm not particularly grounded today. But also, you know, we can't feel everything. If you were able to feel your digestive processes, you'd go insane with the amount of information. So what we feel is often limited. If we're cut off from feeling in the body, and we tend to just be thinking our way through life and quite shut off, neck down, that's quite an unsafe feeling for the body, and it's how a lot of people live. They will just keep going even though they're exhausted, and they'll get to burnout point because they weren't listening to the signals of you're tired, you're doing exercise that's continually injuring you, you keep doing, pushing without the requisite recovery and rest, which is a vastly intelligent part of any movement, any exercise, any health. And if you keep going without listening underneath, the body's going to start talking back in the only way that it knows how, which is shouting, and that is pain. So embodiment is the root out of this disconnect. And we can do that through meditation, in a sense of really being present to how we feel and where we are. But we can also do it through moving practices that give us a real palpable sense of self.
So let's say somebody, like, they've done the diet, they've done the herbs, like they've done the physical healing. Where do they need to look to next to make sure that they're covering that emotional aspect of it?
Well, looking to your past and looking to the traumatic or challenging events that you got through but never got over. And what I mean by that is your life, you got through them. Maybe you were abandoned by a parent, but you're in a good marriage now. So you think, I'm good, my abandonment issues are over, but you've never really grieved that. Like you've never really felt your feelings about that. It may be time to go back. And this is where I think working with a skilled therapist, practitioner, even a coach who has training in psychology, a somatic therapist, EMDR, finding I like to call it a technician, finding someone that can help you go back to those scary places. Because why we're so afraid to go back to trauma or challenging times is because we remember how hard it was, remember how awful it felt, and we don't want to re-experience it again. However, the truth is we're re-experiencing it every day by holding those emotions in. So I'm always of the mindset that you might as well temporarily have the discomfort of going back there for the sake of processing and releasing it, rather than carry it around literally in your body, specifically your gut, for the rest of your life.
That was Christine Hassler again. As someone who's personally overcome a lot of trauma, as well as working with thousands of patients who've done the same, I completely agree with what Christine says here. We have a tendency to get over things. We move on, but a lot of the time we haven't processed that trauma completely, and it can then express itself later in our lives, hindering us in all kinds of ways. If this is new to you, I'd recommend finding someone who can help guide you through this process. There was something I'd seen Kate Reardon speak about before, and that was how, when things are really close to us, we can't even see them. Is what you're thinking really true? I asked Kate Reardon to explain this.
So we think that what is in our conscious mind is true. And the ego gets so fixated on what we think is true. Is that true or not? I don't know. And so an analogy I'll use because you can't see me is looking at the 6 and the 9. And this exactly happened with my daughter yesterday. She brought these blocks. She's 3 years old. She's starting to learn her numbers. And she had a 6 and a 9. And she said, Mummy, is this 6 or is this 9? And I was sitting opposite her. And I'm like, it really depends on where you're looking from. And that's just a perfect example because people on the left would be adamant, this is 6. I'm seeing 6. There is no way that this is a 9 because this is a 6. And there's people on the opposite side saying, that's a 9. How can you say that's a 6? That's a complete 9. And so whichever, if you're coming from the left or the right side, whatever you're seeing and perceiving and believing to be true is coming from the conscious mind of only your lived life experience. And of course there's truth in that, of course, but there is so much more. And so it's a change in perspective, but it's actually being open to potential and possibility. And the thing that's really imperative, I think, in all of this is that when you're fixated on something, it's a contracted state. And, of course, there's going to be firm beliefs about how we see the world and our safety and, our integrity and our value system and our core values as human beings. Those don't change so much, but it's the little things. So, for example, I'm never going to get over this cold, and that's like a simple thing that we all go through. But with that mindset and that kind of contracted state of being, whereas if you were in it all open going, wow, I've got some kind of thing attached to my body right now and it's really unusual and I'm feeling all these symptoms and it must be clearing something out. It'll be gone in a couple of days. I'm just going to take such good care of myself to really help this move through.
For some of you, this might seem a bit woo-woo, and believe me, it is, but I wouldn't have dedicated an episode to it if I didn't think it was important. In my book, Get Well, Stay Well, I have a chapter called Think Yourself Healthy. I talk about the placebo and nocebo effect in relation to healing. This is a really great bridge for those that are new to the fact that our emotions influence our health. The placebo effect was discovered by scientists when they were trialling drugs. What we know is that when you conduct a double-blind trial where one person will get the drug and the other person will get a non-active placebo, a large portion of the people on the placebo will get better. In fact, studies show that the placebo effect accounts for 18 to 80% of patient recovery. The placebo effect is a well-known and accepted principle in mainstream medicine that shows that you can literally think yourself healthy. Think about that for a minute. Simply with the intention and thought that you will get better, you can impact how you recover. Here's Kate Reardon's thoughts on the placebo effect.
So, yeah, I mean, I love the placebo effect. And I say to my patients all the time, who cares if it's placebo? If you're healing and growing and opening and expanding, that's great. Like, who gives a shit what it's from? Sorry, am I allowed to swear? Beep. Block that out. But, I think, again, the thing that placebo shows us and what it reinforces is how powerful the mind is. And you look at any placebo studies, it's just so fascinating to read about how powerful that whole thing actually is. And so, again, it comes down to these beliefs that we hold for ourselves and others as well. It's not the make or break of our healing because the intelligence is so far beyond that, but if you're open and willing, then you're just giving yourself the best possible chance that you need to move forward and heal.
What you might not have heard of is the nocebo effect. The nocebo effect is when you think that you're going to get a negative reaction to something. You get the reaction even if you're taking a placebo, which doesn't even contain the compound. This concept is very important, and I want this to sink in for you. If you don't believe that you will get better, it will be very hard for you to heal. If you believe that when you eat, you're going to react to the food, what do you think will happen? I want to leave you with this. Your mindset, emotions, and beliefs are powerful mediums to both enhance healing and to impair it. The very first step is observation and awareness. What is your thought process in relation to your body, your symptoms, and your wellness journey? Let's end this episode with Jodie. I'm going to be honest, when Jodie said this next part, I had tears in my eyes because this is my exact hope for every person that we work with. This is why I do what I do. And my hope is that each and every one of you can achieve this type of shift in your health and your life.
Old Jodie would have had a breakout. Oh my gosh, why is this happening? I'm so stressed out. This is really annoying. I need to cover it more. And I'm just really annoyed at myself. Why did you get that breakout, Jodie? And new Jodie is oh, your body's trying to tell you something. What have you been eating? Have you been exercising? Have you been deep breathing? Have you been doing mindfulness? And so it's actually now that a pimple comes, I kind of thank it because I'm thank you for whatever you're trying to tell me.
In the next episode of The Shift, we're going to do a deep dive on the microbiome. We've talked about this quite a bit throughout the series because it is so central to everything. But in the next episode, you're going to get the complete lowdown.
Coming up on The Shift.
Why is the microbiome important?
Is returning the clock back 10 or 20 years. The main form of life on Earth is microbial.
Going there, it definitely threw into perspective my disconnection from my food supply.
I believe, we have this gift of the microbiome.
That's where we should be looking.
And it's an amazing thing to me to think, what's our relationship with microbes? We are microbial, in essence.
I hope you're loving the information in The Shift as much as I do. But maybe you're thinking, what do I need to do for me? Take our online assessment to discover what your gut is up to. Go to theshiftclinic.com/quiz.
The Shift!
This series is produced by Must Amplify. hosted by Catherine Maslin. Executive producer Ronsley Vaz. Music and sound design by Shade Furlong. Thank you to all of our experts. For more details on them, go to theshiftclinic.com/gut.
Still listening? Next up, we're going to release the Expert Series, featuring more in-depth conversations with our 24 experts. Make sure you subscribe so you don't miss a thing.
Thank you for listening.
Every listen or download of this show
Enhance this voice.
Directly funds the ending of sex
and human trafficking.
A voice for a voice.
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 Find out more at
Amplify
Impacts.com.